since then has been to try to build an order that could not only secure peace and security, but hopefully also an element of freedom and prosperity for every part of our continent. And it is these efforts that are now under such a mortal threat from the military aggression initiated by Vladimir Putin 10 months ago. Europe hasn't seen anything since when Adolf Hitler in September 1939 launched his all-out attack against Poland. And there are important similarities between the two cases. In both cases, it was war started by a personal decision of a dictator that didn't really feel any constraints whatsoever. In both cases, it was war started by dictators driven by some sort of vision derived of history of what they wanted to achieve. Hitler wanted to get rid of independent Poland. It was an unnecessary creation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. Putin wants to get rid of Ukraine as an independent entity. He describes this as an unnecessary mistake and creation by, of all people, Vladimir Lenin. Hitler, of course, then continued. When he attacked and occupied Norway, it was described as absolutely necessary to safeguard the security interests of his greater Germany. We know how it all ended. But we don't know how this horrible war will end. So his intention is abundantly clear in the speeches that he gave immediately before and immediately after the invasion. Then John said that, well, he didn't have the resources to do it. That's fairly obvious by now, agree. But we should be aware of the fact that when he attacked on February 24th, he attacked with 90% of the combat potential of the Russian army, 90%. So he would clearly, and he attacked from the north in order to get Kiev, biggest city, from the west to get Kharkiv, second biggest city, from the south to get Odessa, the third biggest city. He attacked with missiles every single major center across the territory of Ukraine. It was not some sort of Sunday expedition by some Russian forces who had got lost in the woods. It was an all-out invasion. It failed due to the fact that the Russian army was less competent than he thought, and as a matter of fact, substantially less competent than most of us thought. Because even the Western intelligence agencies who said he's likely to invade thought that he was going to finish the job in a week. He believed that as well. We know a fair amount of his political preparations. He believed he could do it in 1 or 2 weeks. The Ukrainians proved otherwise. If there were anyone pushing, Poles pushed in order to become members of NATO, the Ukrainians were knocking on our door all the time. We want a closer relationship with the European Union. We want to be part of the West. It wasn't the West going east. It was the East wanted to go west.
When you're a high-ranking official talking about diplomatic efforts in Ukraine, the last thing you want to do is drop your guard.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
But that is exactly what reportedly happened between US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt. The exchange has since surfaced online, including the crude swipe at the European Union. The audio clip of a woman and man, said to be Nuland and Pyatt, hears them discussing strategies to work with the three main opposition figures.
I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
There is a suggestion for Nuland to contact Klitschko directly to play to his top dog sensibilities, while Nuland refers to getting the United Nations involved in a political solution. And that's where the unfortunate comment arises.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming here.
This was Nuland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied. The clip was said to have been posted online by the Russian deputy PM, but that has not yet been confirmed.
In order to get more of the security, the prosperity that they rightly or wrongly associate with the European Union and indeed NATO. And Americans were fairly reluctant in the beginning. If you take the entire crisis that led up to the first invasions, first the Crimea one and then the Novorossiya ones in 2014, the Americans were fairly absent from the scene. They were fairly absent from the scene because they were engaged in other things.
When you're a high-ranking official talking about diplomatic efforts in Ukraine, the last thing you want to do is drop your guard.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
It was the Ukrainians pushing, and rightly so, in my opinion. Then finally, just the Russians consider it an existential threat with Ukraine. Why on earth would they consider it an existential threat? I mean, that's pure fantasy land. I wouldn't deny that there are Mr. Patrushev and others, but we should take them out of that. If they consider their neighbors to be existential threats, they're going to be the one invasion after the other. There's no way that Ukraine is going to invade Russia. No one has ever thought in those particular terms. Was the big problem in 2013 and 2014, and I was there, was the fact that Ukraine wanted to have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And it was the Ukrainians who wanted it. They were knocking on the EU door time after time after time. Not everyone in the EU was enthusiastic, but evidently that was given. And then Putin said, this is utterly unacceptable. Forced President Yanukovych with the most brutal means.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming here.
This was Nuland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
To go back on that caused the people of Ukraine to go to the square in Maidan waving, they didn't wave American flags, sorry to say, they waved the EU flags on the Maidan and say, we want to be part of this. And why? Not because they were anti-Russian. That was not an issue at the moment. They saw the success of Poland, for example, having done the democratic reforms and having done the economic reforms and having a substantially better economic and social and political development.
Let me make two sets of responses to what Carl said. He makes the argument, which many people make, that there was really no chance that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And that we have sort of given up on that. I believe that's simply not true. And in June of 2021, NATO's conference was held at Brussels. In an official statement released by NATO, they said that they were reinvigorating their commitment to bring Ukraine into NATO. On November 10th, 2021, the United States and Ukraine issued a white paper laying out the strategic relationship between the United States and Ukraine, where we made it unequivocally clear we were committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Furthermore, we were arming and training the Ukrainians so that they were effectively becoming a de facto member of NATO. Many people wonder why the Ukrainians have done so well against the Russians on the battlefield. And they say it's because the Russians are incompetent, period, end of story. That's half of the story. The other half is that the Ukrainians were a formidable fighting force. And they were a formidable fighting force because we were training 10,000 Ukrainian troops per year from 2014 to 2024. And we were arming the Ukrainians. President Zelensky and his defense minister today refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, in fact, and then in principle, we remain committed to bringing it into the alliance. Now, okay, go ahead. No, let me make one quick point just on another issue that Carl raised. Carl raised the point that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming a liberal democracy as a serious threat. And you said you agreed with me on that. The point I want to make is that NATO, mainly the United States, was pursuing a three-pronged strategy. I tried to make that clear in my formal presentation. NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a liberal democracy. So it's important to understand that that third strand that Carl was talking about, where he and I agree, that third strand is inextricably linked to the second strand and the first strand in the minds of the Russians. So when Go ahead.
Now, in the minds of Putin, don't say that Putin and the Russians are necessarily the same things. I've been involved with Russia intensely since the early 90s. I made a lot of friends. I worked very closely together with two Russian foreign ministers I still consider my friends, and one of them I'm still in contact with. And in the Balkans, we work constructively with them. I have to say that all of my friends from those years are either dead, killed, murdered, in prison or outside of Russia. But those were Russians that wanted the same thing as the Ukrainians. They wanted constitutional government in their country. They wanted sort of decent living standards. They wanted free speech. They wanted some sort of democracy, might not have been Swedish standards. But Putin has a security regime that is different. And he has faced demonstrations in Russia that he fights with violence after he returned to power, and he's seen colored revolutions as a threat against the regime. That's why I'm saying, in that particular respect, he's right. He considers the colored revolutions, democracy in other parts of the former Soviet Union, as a threat to his regime. But that, to be precise, is not something that's invented by me or by American politicians. That is demands coming from the people in these countries themselves. Democracy, it's called.
Can I just quick go back?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to. I hope you don't mind us going back and forth, but
okay.
I mean, this fits together neatly. I think that if you talk about Russian elites regarding the issue that we're talking about tonight, the question is, how do the Russian elites think about bringing Ukraine into NATO? And you might think from listening to Carl talk that there's disagreement among the Russian elites. I do not believe that's the case. And Bill Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, wrote a famous memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he said, for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines. He said, I've talked to all of the knuckle draggers in the depths of the Kremlin. And he said, I've talked to Putin's most ardent liberal critics, and they all agree to a person that Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. So on that particular issue, which is the issue on the table this evening, there is unanimity. This is why, Carl, I would say that, if Putin is overthrown, you're not going to get somebody in there who is interested in cutting a deal and living with Ukraine and NATO. You'll get somebody who's probably more hawkish than Ukraine, or at least as hawkish.